we're talking about these topics in the context of the time, and I thought it would be important to call out that this is not an evergreen episode. It will be dated eventually.
These are transformative, job creating, infrastructure creating, industry creating type of legislations. Now, you could argue these are inflationary, but it's the good type of inflation. These are the type of inflation that is going to support the industrial plant as we have deglobalized.
And the personage of Chairman Mao looked ahead into the future and understood that given the current technology, that the Chinese would be starving in a few decades if the population growth continued the trend that it was on.
It took one word from their ruling king, Trump, to shut down the border bill so they could gaslight the Democrats and say, look at Joe Biden's border. Look at the problem here. When conversely, the same people, the voters, will vote for Trump, even though I hear them, the farmers, talking about how they can't get enough labor. They need the illegal labor. The irony is crazy. They're talking about an actual real issue. They want the illegal labor, but they don't. They want the wall too at the same time.
I think Pierce and I both see is the most amazing economic growth opportunity ever in our history. And the population that's going to help us do that might be being kept out at a border that we never developed the policy around, making it so that someone could be vetted and qualified to work in our country for a certain number of years before they had to reapply. We just did away with anything that would make that happen in a sensible, cogent way, and have never fixed it.
Hi, welcome to the XY Chromies, Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turned renewable energy engineers discuss veteran issues, science, geopolitics, and everything in between. Currently, right now, I'm working on a number of projects, new dam and new hydroelectric projects. There's certain dams that are being decommissioned right now, and we're building new dams to replace them that are just right downstream from them, that are a little bit better in geography. They can get a little bit more power capture to a lot more power capture, considering a whole new dam is quite an endeavor. And I thought this was a really good time to just talk about what the IRA, what's happening with the Inflation Reduction Act, and like what's happening within the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically from my own perspective. And so a couple things are really cool right now. Much of the CAISO, which is the California grid, Oregon, Washington, the West Coast grid, essentially, I think Colorado's a part of that as well. CAISO basically, and specifically California, survived the last couple heat waves this summer so far without having rolling blackouts. Now, this hasn't happened in over a decade, at least to a degree, essentially, in some form or fashion. And the reason that we were able to avoid these rolling blackouts and the reason our grid has been far more stabilized is we're upgrading the grid. We are currently upgrading our electrical grid. All the electrical companies are upgrading the grid right now to be able to be more resilient to extreme climate events. Much of what we were doing here in California was utilizing DERs, which is distributed energy resource, and we were distributing energy gathered from solar using batteries. We used batteries to offset the loads. We used batteries to balance the grid for reactive power. And then we also used batteries in lieu of some of the pickup generators, the natural gas generators that we'd normally use in the events of power stabilization. And so I kind of just wanted to kick off our talk about that a little bit, what I'm doing right now in the industry and what a lot of my colleagues in different other engineering consulting firms and other large builders are working on right now. So,
yeah, the Inflation Reduction Act is something that people learning American history in 2060 are going to spend some time on.
Yeah,
because it will be defining in their lives, or at least in terms of the legacy that it leaves behind. And maybe we don't just go around with it in the forebrain, understanding that the infrastructure that we have been living with for the last, what, almost 75 years in some places, but shorter amounts of time in others, because rural electrification didn't happen all at once in an instant. It took years to do. But the electrification of this country is something we've learned to completely take for granted, and that the hardware and systems and automation devices and the step down and step ups and all these different pieces that go into an infrastructure like our electric power grid in general, not to mention, as you said, there's actually a interconnect between states where some states participate and other states don't. So they participate in a different interconnect. But these are big parts of this. But that is aging hardware. And there has been significant technological leaps in power management systems, automation systems,
high voltage cables, high voltage transmission lines.
Just the material science that goes into transmission lines, that goes into the devices. So transmission lines start and end in places, and so the devices that deal with them at the endpoints, and that just being under constant electric energization means that things degrade because there's expansion on the materials. There's expansion and contraction. There's all these different things that wear them down. And we've been very lucky to have it kind of work mostly, for the most part, for 70 years. But there's a book by an author named, I'm going to get her last name wrong because I don't know how to pronounce vowels, but I think her last name was Bake. It's like Gretchen Bake.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's 2 A's in her name. So Gretchen wrote this book on the grid that it's a dry read for most of us. For enthusiasts like myself and Pearson, it's kind of an interesting look at how the grid works, and there's no pictures to go with it. So you kind of have to imagine how it fits and works together. But she describes a couple of the big interruptions in our modern electric power system that, were newsworthy, and they happened at a time when it was critical for environmental systems in our buildings to work, because it would have been really cold or really hot. And she just sort of describes some of these cascading effects that where, sure, it's one branch off of one tree that lands on one power line, but it happened to be just the right power line and just the right part of the interconnect that when it went down, it pulled down multiple systems across international boundaries and things like that. So yeah, to hear that you're a part of the Inflation Reduction Act at its implementation is really exciting and interesting. It just, you're seeing what it means for there to be a major injection of federal funding into projects that affect people locally. And I mean, we definitely have the 1930s as a point of reference for what that looks like and how it changes the country. Because a lot of those bridges that we used on the West Coast to cross Alsea Bay went into the 1930s. And, there are a lot of things that changed, and rural electrification started then because of these federal government projects that were started. And
the New Deal.
They've been few and far between. And so now we're sort of seeing a New Deal, because that's our frame of reference for what this looks like.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. If you're a student of history, the 1930s are a really, really interesting period of time. And if you're looking at, if you're trying to figure out what time in history America is most similarly going through, you're going to have some trouble, because there's going to be a couple converging points where history had some similarities to where we are now. The 1930s rings true in a lot of cases because we had the first real rise of the labor union movement happened in the 1930s. Inequality after the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl was at all-time highs, which led to FDR having basically a 20-year stint as a president because of these, because he was really fighting for the working class. He was fighting for the everyday person at the time. And the New Deal was, and the labor protections that came with that legislation was transformative. We had the rise of labor unions. We also had the rise of the Nazi Party within the U.S. as well as, obviously within Germany. But there was a lot of social upheaval, of course, due to that economic stress, which usually you cause. So you could see a lot of the similarities there. But then you'd also be like, we're kind of experiencing stagflation. We are having a lot of growth. This seems similar to the 1970s, when there were the OPEC wars and Nixon couldn't tame inflation. And really no one could for about 10 years until, Paul Volcker, a certain Fed, decided to, raise interest rates really high. So we see like a confluence of different historical times, and then we have some ahistory at the same time happening as well. So the IRA and the CHIPS Act, I would argue as well, there's a new nuclear act legislation that went through this year as well. That's a subsidy on nuclear power as well. These are transformative, job creating, infrastructure creating, industry creating type of legislations. Now you could argue these are inflationary, but it's the good type of inflation. These are the type of inflation that is going to support the industrial plant as we have deglobalized. So all of these things are kind of confluing together, and with the noise and the culture war that's happening right now and the fever pitch of the MAGA Republicans, basically going full fascist, it's hard to see what's really happening in America, the engine of America right now. But I would argue there's a lot of really positive things happening in terms of infrastructure. I'm not only working on new dams, we're retrofitting dams all over the country right now to have black start capabilities. And black start capabilities just means that the dams will now be able to add to the grid when we're starting it back up if there's been a blackout. Now, before this, hydroelectric power always was going to be able to do this if they had been fitted to do this, if they had been made to do this, because all you need is because hydro is direct AC to AC conversion of power, which is really cool. That means that you can control the frequency of power that you're getting by opening the gates and allowing different measures of flow to happen. So there's a little engineering stuff, but basically the idea is that before, to get our grid to start back up, we had to use a bunch of inertial machines, generators that created an inertia and a frequency, and they would balance the grid and bring systems and loads online. And they would use a lot of diesel generators and gas generators and things like that. Those were the early starters. Now we can use hydropower, those same diesel and gas generators, and batteries to do these things. So these are newer improvements that we're doing to the grid right now. And we're seeing this everywhere. I could go on. There's a ton of other projects that I'm working on right now where we're upgrading solar for remote stations for hydro companies right now. So hydro company is having us do solar for them as well. There's just so much cool stuff happening right now that's new and modern that I think a lot of people don't get to see.
What you described with the technology of how hydro turbines work is also one of those things that until you have to immerse yourself in the subject matter, you just think that, you just open a gate, a turbine gets turned by some water, that's the grid, right? No. There's a specific way that power generating dynamos work, and it doesn't work quite the way you think it does.
And it's changing as well, too, as we watch. The inverter technology specifically is changing as well. For all my power electronic heads out there, they would know that we're going from lagging inverters to leading inverters. These will be inverters that will allow for renewable energy sources to input on the grid inertia side and the balancing of the grid side. So, and batteries are doing all kinds of really cool things we can do with batteries that the ISOs are figuring out. And the ISOs are the ones that are managing generally the grid within these interconnected states. So anyways, we've been talking a lot about politics and stuff, and I thought it would be nice to kind of mingle some engineering and some fun, some good news there before we kind of dove into our part 3 of Project 2025.
So sometimes it's nice to produce a program like ours where we talk about things that are disconnected from the current time that are evergreen. That's not what we've been talking about lately. The last couple of programs have been very contemporary and are of a time, and I don't know. It will be interesting in 10 years and 20 years and farther into the future, what of this is left over that people can view from that perspective and look back on it and see what was going on. The topic of Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation is something that is now very easy to find commentary on YouTube channels. There's people all over the place talking about it. And there's people talking about it in despairing lights, and there's people talking about it with a nuanced perspective and maybe suggestions for how to confront the potential changes that it would bring or to prevent it from happening in the first place. So the place and time that we are currently is one where a former president of the United States is making a bid for re-election. He sustained a sniper attack and attempted assassination in our present time. And the current president of the United States, they faced off in 2020, they were going to face off again, has rescinded his candidacy. And now the vice president of the United States is the forerunner for the Democratic Party as the candidate for president. And
all within a month.
Yeah, we just fit it all into a couple of days. And so this comes on the tail end of the current sitting president having will be remembered. I think will be remembered well if history is honest. If the way that history reflects on its leading figures is honest, I think that our current president will be well remembered and partially because of what Pierce is describing, and partially because we've scarcely ever seen so much focus for the presidency on our national infrastructure and our national integrity as we've seen with this administration. So this is going to be a very interesting historical figure, or Joe Biden is going to be an interesting historical figure as he is compared to every other commander-in-chief that's come before him and come after.
Yes. Sorry. Go ahead.
And so his resignation from the candidacy for president is at the end of a couple of weeks now of contemporaries in the Democratic Party telling him that his age will make him a weaker candidate in the competition, which he may lose, and the stakes have never been higher.
Mm-hmm.
And so in our contemporary times, you can go and find his Oval Office speech that is impassioned and not easy to keep the tears back watching, because he's proven himself to be an impressive American, an impressive historical figure. And what he said to the American public is, and this is going to be the end of my political career as we have known it. So over 50 years, he's served America in some capacity, either as a state senator, as a vice president, as a commander-in-chief. And part of the reason why we could reflect on his efficacy as the senior administrator of our nation is that he has a historical perspective that few of us can even wrap our minds around, let alone have the experience of. And so we're talking about these topics in the context of the time, and I thought it would be important to call out that this is not an evergreen episode. It will be dated eventually, and that it might actually be an interesting look within the watch glass of time of what was happening as we were talking about these ideas where every segment of the American public could potentially be touched by policy, and touched in a way that we don't like. It's not good for us, and would have consequences for generations afterward. even if someone was able to reverse all of the doctrine that's contained in Project 2025 in 4 years, but that's the part of the plan, is to make it so that's impossible to do, or very, very hard without bloodshed. So with that context, please take it away.
It's funny. Yes, Joe Biden, hopefully, if his story books are still being made and relatively honest, he'll be looked at as one of probably the top 5 presidents in modern history, at least, up there with FDR and Roosevelt for sure. He'll be one of those classic 4-year presidents who got a lot done in 4 years for 4 years, and then for whatever reason was not allowed to be in the second term. Polk, if you've ever had a Polk Street or Polk County, one of my favorite unsung 4-year presidents, a very old president, by the way, who ran on the idea that he would only run for 4 years. And he is responsible for a third of America. Yeah, he was one of those 4 years. He died 3 days after he left the presidency, actually. So, yeah, he had a plan. He had a mission. He went in. He got California. He got Texas. He got everything in between. And then he died. So he did some other stuff, too. I'm misremembering all of what Polk did, but I'm reminded of that. You know, God, I've learned a lot, and my mind has been blown since the 2016 election. You know, I correctly predicted Trump would win to all my friends in Portland at the time who were laughing at me. I didn't want him to win, but I just knew he was going to. I had a good idea he was going to. I begrudgingly voted for Biden in 2020. I was very begrudging about it. I was upset. I had lost Andrew Yang as a candidate at first. I was into him. And then I was really into Bernie, of course, because I was a Bernie bro in 2016. And being an Oregonian, never get to vote on Bernie in the primaries because by then, you know, it's already been decided after Super Tuesday. So I never got to vote for Bernie. But I really wanted to vote for him in both of those elections, and I didn't get to. And I told everybody at the time, I was like, I will vote for, you know, a celery stick instead of Donald Trump in 2020. So of course I will vote for Joe Biden, but he was the candidate out of the 24 who ran who I was the least excited about.
Yeah.
And his 4 years of presidency taught me so much of what it means to actually be a president, to actually run the country during one of the most divisive times in our history. Just similar. Yeah. I mean, just it is. To get what he was able to get done while one of our major enemies, Russia, invaded Ukraine, a sovereign country, and then Israel and Palestine popped off as well. All of this had to happen. He had to pull out of Afghanistan earlier than he even planned because of the Russia-Ukraine intel was happening. And all while dealing with 60% of the Republican Party believing that the election was stolen. And a lot of them still believe this because their commander-in-chief that they, you know, are still think as the president somehow in their weird, wacky head, is still saying that it was stolen. He had to contend with all the most, you know, one of the most contentious Republican Congress out there to deal with. And, you know, against Senate members stopping military confirmations like Tommy Tuberville for a year, which means that there was like hundreds of upper echelon intelligence officers who didn't have the proper security clearance to even look at the intel for a year because of those confirmations during a wartime where we're trying to manage a Cold War. He had to manage a lot of crazy things. He had to fight the Supreme Court every which way he could with the student loan forgiveness, and he's still fighting that battle. And he managed to get so much legislation done. The Climate Corps of Engineers, the IRA, the CHIPS Act, the battery bill, the auto bill, the EV bill, the infrastructure bill, the American Jobs Act, the nuclear deal. So he created new trade deals with Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, basically blocking out China. All of this happened, by the way. The CHIPS Act was an attack on China. There's a deterrent. Like, these are deterrents to our actual competitors, our actual enemies out there. And he did all of this. This is what his administration, when I'm saying he, like policy-wise, he crushed it. And what I realized for the longest time was that, and I still love Bernie. So if Bernie ever sees this, don't take, and if you're a Bernie bro or Bernie sis, don't take this as an insult. But Bernie represented someone who is purely idealist, like a pure ideology almost. And he's even shown that he's willing to compromise his backing of Joe Biden and his ability to work within the Biden administration. He's been a lot more compromising than I think he's been in the past. But Bernie always represented pure ideology. And because he would spout the same things 45 years ago about wealth inequality, elderly not being taken care of, college kids not being, all the things he was spouting, he was saying this stuff 45 years ago. Same tune. And
it was obvious back then as it is now.
Yeah.
We just were deciding to focus on things that didn't fix it.
And that ideology, what I didn't realize was probably going to make him a far more ineffective president, even though I liked him a lot more. And I believed in what he was saying. And Joe Biden proved what a moderate center of the aisle, work as much as you can to get everybody the most benefits as you possibly can. He represented someone who could do that. He came from the state of corporations, Pennsylvania. He's probably gotten campaign finances from every large corporation in the country at some point. So it almost made him like agnostic to any, like he didn't owe any one party or any one donor anything, because he's been in politics for 50 years. They've all donated to him. If you owe everybody something, then you don't really have to listen to any of them, and you can just do things for the people. And I do feel like much of what Joe Biden was trying to do was for the people. So,
and in his Oval Office address, that comes through as that is the most sincere message that you get from him. And I thought it was Delaware. I thought he was a senator from Delaware.
You might be right.
I bet we'll be able to check on that. And
he might be from Pennsylvania, but he might be the senator of.
Could be. You hit upon something that I think is a really super important idea about the office of the president. The president's job is to preside. The president's job is to form coalitions within the structure of that administration. Those people work on the projects. They handle the creation and execution of policy. He presides over this. He breaks ties. He guides people in the creation of policy. But Joe Biden isn't up sitting at an Electrolux typewriter and typing a policy at night. No, he's going to meetings. He's doing stuff that a executive of a very big organization does all the time, while in the background, the entirety of the operation of the country is delegated to everyone who is an expert at that thing that they do, which is, in reflecting back on what Project 2025 declares its intent is to eliminate that bureaucracy. And bureaucracy gets a derogatory name. Its connotation is that it's inefficient and flawed and broken, and that people get, screwed by it. Bureaucracy is how you fix potholes. Bureaucracy is how you develop bills that change the face of the economics and economic prospects and outcomes of North America, which is a super important idea that I'm going to use. I'm going to take that piece right there, and we're going to go into something that I think is unbelievably important about when we contemplate who our presidential candidates are, what policies they're talking about putting into place, what they claim is going to be their platform of governance and so forth. And that is that. So North America is considered Mexico, the United States, and Canada, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Central America is the nations
Nicaragua,
that
Costa Rica,
bridge,
yep,
yeah, that
Venezuela.
bridge between Mexico and South America. And if you talk to your demographer friends, you'll find out some very interesting things about the demography of the nations of this hemisphere, the nations of the Eastern Hemisphere, and specifically developed industrial nations. There's a thing that seems like a mystery until you kind of dig into it a little bit, that industrialized nations, if you look at the demographic trends in the ages of people and the populations of those ages of people, you see a trend line where the population is aging, which also means the corollary to that is there are fewer and fewer young people being born every year. So when we look at the demography of the Western Hemisphere, it's fairly healthy. What we're hoping to see is a replacement number of people being born in every nation so that it sustains a population pyramid or a population shape where there's more young people than there are old people at the top.
Or at least a chimney based on a demography map. If you know what, if you've ever seen a demography map, and you can Google one right now, or you could just listen to a Peter Zion talk about it. He's the demography guy for sure. You'll see the chart. Anyways. Yeah.
So the chimney shape is where all the bars that represent males and females as they're considered in the demographic polls, the census, that those are equal on both sides and kind of stay the same throughout time.
Vertical.
That's a chimney shape.
Generally vertical, yeah.
And it's considered still healthy because you ostensibly have people paying into systems that younger people paying into systems that older people benefit from, which is how we're set up right now.
Yeah.
Where it gets problematic is when it's no longer a chimney, but it begins to become an inverted pyramid where there are more older people up to a certain age. It still tapers off at the end, but there are more older people at a certain age than there are younger people participating in the economic system and paying into a system that older people extract from.
To see examples of this, if you guys are following along and would like to see demography that look really poor, the ultimate would be either Thailand or South Korea. They have the lowest demography, I believe, in the world right now, but this number is they're competing pretty rapidly with everybody from the Germans, the Japanese, to the Russians, and the Ukrainians, sadly, as well. So, I mean, I just named about 7 of the top 10. Was that 7? Or 5 to 7 or whatever, however many nations I just named. These are like some of the top 10 that have serious demographic issues right now.
The big one is China.
Yes, China.
China's demographic collapse is imminent. It will be, I mean, it's measured in decades, but
it's
the number of people that
kind of right now, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, collapses, people think of a building collapsing, so it's like all at once, but like the structural integrity of that building was compromised for years if it's just collapsing now, right? Like that might just be the catalyst, but anyways, go ahead. Sorry.
And there are reasons for that. In fact, China is a good example of one where we can say that at the same time that China's leadership, the People's Republic of China's Communist Party, in the personage of Chairman Mao, looked ahead into the future and understood that given the current technology, that the Chinese would be starving in a few decades if the population growth continued on the trend that it was on. And so maybe you've heard of this thing called a one-child policy. At about the same time in history, co-located within the same decade, the 1970s, the nation of China was brought into the global trade system that the United States was propping up, and they entered a period of industrialization and urbanization. So whereas people living in the boundaries of China would have been subsistence farmers and there was some industry and there was some urban centers, there's nothing like there is now. And so in the nation of China, the demographic plots are astounding, and their reporting was not always very honest. In fact, in communist systems, you're encouraged to lie about everything, because if you lie long enough, you can probably prop up your local part of the system for a while.
They lied.
And
They got
so-
more money from the government too. They were lying about population to get more subsidies from the government. That was the way the system was put in place. So yeah, and lying is encouraged in China, even within academia. Like people tout
Yeah.
the Chinese academic system like it's about cheating and getting away with cheating, by the way.
Yeah.
If you actually talk to people from China who've gone through the school system there, yeah, and by the way, yeah, we do get a lot of their talent over here. So, anyways,
There are missing millions of people that are supposed to be on the demographic rolls, on those demographic charts.
like
For that
100
nation.
million. Like they miss it. It ballooned to about 100 million miscalculated, and that adjustment, I think, recently has been categorized now within China. They finally accounted for it, like during COVID. The 100 million, the lost 100 million demography.
So a replacement rate in human populations is a number above 2. So 2.2,
2.1.
2.1. 2 point something is pretty good. You kind of want to be one decimal. So 2.2 or 2.3 is primo.
Yeah, I've got
Hard to
two kids.
sustain.
I have 2 kids and 2 dogs, so I'm right there. I think that's 2.2. I don't know. A dog is like 0.1 of a kid, I guess, at this point. I mean, I think they're worth. One of the dogs is probably worth 0.2. The other one is like 0.5. No offense, Arya.
I don't know what their participation rate in the workforce is going to be, but you're just counting biomass. I think you're spot on.
Yeah, biomass. Anyway,
So when we talk about these demographic crises, we're talking about nations whose replacement rate is below the number 2. And in South Korea, that's a number like 1.2.
yeah, it is.
Right.
Right on the money, actually. I think that I looked it up like last week because me and my wife were talking
Mm-hmm.
about this. Sarah, we're talking about this.
So when you look at the United States, we have a demographic plot. Ours is a little more accurate than the one from China, and our census is a little more accurate and regular and honestly reported. And we're still above. No,
We're like right at. I think
we're right at 2. We're a little under, I think. Our demography is beginning to stovepipe, or has been stovepiping for the last 40 years too. So we're no longer a nice, pretty triangle where there's lots and lots of people that are under the age of 1, and just a few people that are at the age of 80 or 90. We're more like this with a little bit of a bulge in it because Pierce's generation is pretty big, and
that is true. That would be the
the same is
millennials.
true for the same is true for the baby boom generation, which is on topic for what we're getting into today. So
2.1. So to right on the money, we're still at roughly 2.1 according to the quick Googles, and then also Scranton, PA is technically where Biden's from. But I don't know if that's actually the state he represented. I just got where he was birthed real quick in the quick Google. So
people
anyway.
move around.
Yeah, just wanted to get those facts out there since I checked them. So yeah.
He talked about being a boy that stutters from Delaware, and I thought it's beginning to show up again in this modern time. He stutters when he speaks. And as a person who also can stutter at times, maybe I've even done it on this presentation, it can be upsetting. It can be really challenging to try to have a public career and interact with people in dynamic ways when you get caught up in like 9 things that you try to come out at once.
Yeah.
So the baby boom generation was the largest American generation. We would count it from 1945 to 1965, and sometimes that slider gets moved a little bit one way or the other, but essentially that 20-year period. Gen X, my generation, I'm at the end of it. Started in 1965 and ends, it's debated sometimes it's 1980, 81. I'm a part of the smallest American generation since the baby boomers.
Because your parents were technically supposed to be the silent generation.
Yeah, my
but they might have
parents
been
are
baby
boomers.
boomers. Yeah.
But they're old boomers.
Yeah, and you're young Gen X, and I'm oldish millennial, and my parents were old boomers as well. So they had me pretty late in the game, but yeah. So
this sounds like we're really off in the tall weeds, and maybe we are a little bit, but we're just identifying like what it looks like to be a Gen Xer right now.
Yeah.
Guy with gray hair in his beard. What it looks like to be a millennial. A handsome, striking.
I dye my beard. There's gray in the beard. I'm dyeing my beard. Sarah's like, you need to cut that shit down right there until it's fully gray. It's being dyed. So that's the rule, I guess.
And so the baby boom generation is now people in their late 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And they retired in 2020. They had stayed on longer than they wanted to. They wanted to retire about a decade earlier. The financial crisis of 2008 kept them in the workforce a little bit longer. And their workforce is really interesting. Their demographic is really interesting from a labor perspective. Because when the first 18-year-old boomers started in the workforce, it was the mid-1960s. And there was a lot of growth and development going on in the country. We were still doing our project of industrialization.
Tail end of the New Deal-ish, basically, yeah.
But around about the middle of the 1970s, there were all these new 18-year-olds entering the workforce that was really beginning to be a problem because the nature of the economy in this country had changed somewhat. And there were other things going on geopolitically. That's outside of the scope of our conversation. But what I want to give everyone a picture of is what it meant to be coming of age in this country where the value system is one where you got to get out there and earn a living. They were a generation that had kids young. I mean, more than one of my aunts were mothers by the time they were 16.
Jeez. Okay. Yeah.
Right. My mother waited a long time. She was like 20 when I was born. She was an old maid.
Yeah.
So we have this generation where they kind of were pressed into the workforce. And as they entered the workforce, every year more and more boomers entered into the workforce. It created a burden on the infrastructure of labor, period, that they basically busted it.
Yeah.
And they broke it in a way that I think will also be interesting to historians looking back at this time. Because as they entered the workforce, wages were being depressed. And as wages were depressed, it made it harder for them to take care of their kids that they had had in their late teens. And so you would have families that were baby boomer generation age people that had to put both parents into the workforce. Guess what that did?
Mm-hmm.
It depressed wages even more.
Yeah.
So now you have an entire workforce of adults who are navigating the interesting new world that is the Soviet Union's about to collapse in a few years. We don't know that, but it's on its way. And
there's an oil crisis. The whole time, like a decade of oil crisis at least. Yeah.
Just waiting in lines for fuel. They had all these stories
high
about
interest rates, hyperinflation, totally. And yeah.
And they lived through an uncertain time, and yet, still bought houses and, bought cars and went on vacations and, had a bunch of Pierces running around and
yeah. Hopefully not too
many. And so during this time in American history, organized labor took a hit. It's a really interesting story that was, I'm forgetting the podcast that did it. It's one of those WNYC podcasts that talked about, they were interested about spam. And they did this whole series on spam, and they found out that spam was one of the intersections of a massive labor fight in Wisconsin. And it just right in the middle of the early 1980s, and just all these problems.
Yeah.
So while this is going on, there's also a generation of people that are coming of age and ready to enter the workforce in Mexico, in Central America. And there's strife there. There's not stable, things aren't as stable and as beneficial to families and predictable. And, even though we had inflation, we still had a pretty stable monetary unit.
Oh, yeah.
And so during this period of time, there was immigration into this country, people seeking labor, due in part to multiple factors and vectors, not least of which our farm bill is one that actually makes it hard for farmers in the hemisphere to sell their grain, their corn, in a competitive market. We underbid them constantly, so they can't really compete in agriculture. So they basically subsistence farm and send somebody to Texas or New Mexico or California to work in our agricultural system.
Yeah.
And this, of course, was viewed as a profound attack on that generation of people I just described, who were struggling to make ends meet. Their labor unions were failing. There were depressed wages because both spouses were working, and all these other changes were happening. Part of the reason I'm talking about this and talking about demographics and talking about as we move not totally off of Project 2025, but kind of tangentially from it, is this idea that you get doctrine like you see in Project 2025 because we're still thinking about the 1980s as the paradigm for what America is. Demographically, the workforce size, the economic system, like that's programmed into a thing like Project 2025.
Yeah.
The Heritage Foundation was formed during that decade, and for their purposes, there's been no other presidency like the Reagan administration. We could endeavor to be like it, if not better. And by better, I mean more fascist.
I guess, yeah. More Christian fascist. Yeah, more Christo-fascist. I mean, that was the first time that the evangelicals were really tapped into the voter market. And ever since, the Republican Party has become more and more a party of culture war and less a party of, fiscal responsibility. I mean, that's always been a lie to begin with. So yes. It's funny. What it sounds like is that generally there's a portion of baby boomers that are a little bit out of touch of what country they live in. And that's, to be fair, our media hasn't done them any favors. Our media is pretty complicit in the, Fox News, the narrative that there's a horde at our border at any given time that's about to amass was really laughable. I mean, especially this year when Republican senators crafted a border bill. It was a bipartisan border bill where every Democrat who voted on that border bill made tons of concessions. It was a Republican crafted border bill that was supposed to shore up asylum seekers, limit the asylum seekers, and do all these things. And it took one word from their ruling king, Trump, to shut down the border bill so they could gaslight the Democrats and say, look at Joe Biden's border. Look at the problem here. When conversely, the same people, the voters, will vote for Trump, even though I hear them, the farmers, talking about how they can't get enough labor. They need the illegal labor. The irony is crazy. They're talking about an actual real issue. They want the illegal labor, but they don't. They want the wall too at the same time. Yeah.
So you hit upon the fight. So last week, I found myself in the middle of a shouting match between two colleagues where I work about the issue of the border.
I'm listening. I'm going to the bathroom while I listen.
Go ahead. They weren't interested in talking about what it means to have a border and what it means to have a a immigration policy and what it means to have a fiscal narrative around the changing labor force. No, they just wanted to shout past each other these ideas that are talking points from pretty extreme and very black and white pictures of what it means to handle a border with a country that is one of our single greatest trading partners in the Western Hemisphere because of a thing called labor price point. And so I wanted to introduce the idea of demographics to this conversation because demographics matter a ton. Our demographics are such that the largest American generation that's ever existed have all passed into retirement. And they did so very abruptly. There's a few boomers left. They're hanging on. But by and large, they've left the workforce, and they've left the workforce 400,000 workers short every year for the next 9 years.
Easily. And by the way, so to add to this, one of the ways our economy is set up, and the reason why you kind of want a replacement of the generation before, is not just because you need to replace the labor, but the capital allocators. So one thing, I'm about to start talking about some finance and some economic stuff that I don't know a ton about, but I know a little bit about. And so I'm just going to say
grace the top of it.
I'm just going to grace the top of it. And capital allocators are the last capital allocators are the baby boomers right now. They have because they stayed in for an extra 10 years due to the issue. There were some who stayed in because economically they needed to. I would argue there was a good portion of baby boomers who stayed in because they were afraid, but they didn't necessarily economically need to stay in for an extra 10 years. And they acquired an extra $14 trillion worth of wealth or whatever. The baby boomers are by far the richest nation. And when you go into retirement, what happens is you take that money out of a lot of the mutual funds and a lot of the stock market, because now you no longer, the way we set up a lot of our retirements and our pensions, if they had them, but because we switched to the 401k, many people's retirement were based on the stock market. Now that wasn't too big of a deal because as you were acquiring wealth within their 401k, if you had a crash, the idea is that you could recover that back because the stock market generally will always go up eventually. Yeah. But that meant that money was being reallocated by banks and investment firms into the wider world and investing in startups and all kinds of other different forms and mechanisms within our capitalism is capital allocation. Mm-hmm. And so when you have the largest generation leaving, that capital, a lot of it leaves with them. What we've seen, the inflation in housing prices, is those baby boomers leaving and buying the home that they think they're going to die in or something like that, essentially, or their retirement house. And so we did see some inflation from there. We did see some, if you're trying to buy a house and you're a millennial or Gen X and it's really tough right now, you can thank the baby boomers for snaking a lot of those out the last 2 years or 3 years. But that capital allocation is going away. And now the smallest generation in recent history, besides Gen Z, that would be Gen X, we're going to rely on their capital allocation. And so the models are that have to change and shift. And that does mean we're seeing... Yeah. Anyways, I wanted to add to the scenario of where we're looking, Perfect. Why we're hyperinflationary potentially. We could get into deglobalization and a bunch of other things for all the other added causes to why inflation's going to be around for 10 fucking years, guys.
It's why I wanted to mention China's demographics.
Yeah.
Because even though we could talk about Germany's demographics and South Korea and Japan's demographics, which are all in decline, China's are terminal. Yes. China was the workshop of the world for the last 30 years or so. I mean, it was gradual in the 1990s, and then just one day we woke up in the mid 2000s, and every single thing that we bought was made in China. And so that's billions of fingers and eyes assembling things. It's not nothing. It's a workforce, and they were able to work for depressed wages compared to every other workforce on the planet. I mean, this is not the forum for criticizing the economic system and the way that labor is handled in China, but that's what you get is cheap labor. And so that cheap labor could sew garments and put together iPhones and build all kinds of things that went into other products that if it had a semiconductor, the semiconductor might have been made at a fab that was in a different country entirely, but it was built into the thing that became a product in China.
Yeah, the basic ass semiconductors were all made in China. The more advanced ones were not. That's part of the CHIPS Act and the war that's going on right now is specifically China not being allowed to make some of the high-end chips. Yes, you've basically painted a really good picture. It's also why, I mean, the reason Mexico is now our number one trading partner, and that will only increase. I'm just going to tell you right now, is because we're replacing some of that industrial plant with a lot of it with Mexican labor. And the Mexican workforce has leveled up a lot in the last 10 to 20 years. If you didn't know, half of my team are Mexican electrical engineers who know way more than I do actually, and are far more capable and better, frankly, engineers than I am. From what I can tell. And their labor force has very quickly leveled up. And I'm not talking about the ones who are coming over here illegally necessarily. I'm talking about the legal immigrants who are coming from Mexico are highly educated, highly capable. A lot more engineers are coming up from there. And we're watching them. I mean, Mexico's got its cartel problem. We're watching, that's really the big hump and the burden to bear that we have to figure out with them. I think it's a dual country problem.
Yeah. So I wanted to lay out this idea and talk a little bit about this shouting match that two of my colleagues had about this one issue, which is sort of this is going to be one of the things where if this wasn't made into a problem by people that want to make it a problem, it's not. It's actually to our advantage. It would be a lot of these things would be self-evident, and a lot of the solutions to these problems that we're working with are more self-evident. But instead, what we have historically is it's always kind of kept below the surface, but essentially it is a race and ethnicity problem that a segment of our electorate thinks is the most important issue, because for their entire working lives, anyone who was taking a job that they might have taken or that they would have otherwise, for some whatever
they
reason or
technically
another,
qualify for, essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
They saw that as an intrusion on their welfare. And so to take the whole picture in is kind of big and expansive, and like we've talked about, it's geopolitical, but our demographics are healthy for the time being. They will not continue to be above two people, the replacement number, for long. And with that workforce leaving, having created an employment scenario that needed a workforce the size of the baby boom generation, we are now short workers. We're short of the people that could fill those positions. So,
and we need to increase the industrial plant
at the same time.
Double. We need to increase the amount of power output by 3 times within the next 10 years. These things have to happen. Kind of swinging back full circle to my infrastructure discussion. Right. This isn't just happening because we want to upgrade. These things all need to happen. We need way more power on the grid, period, to get what we need done. So
if we want to remain a first world industrial nation, that has to happen.
Yes.
If we want to be something else, we do nothing. If we want stuff, we have to do this. We're very used to having stuff. We're very used to being able to procure things easily and to move projects along easily because stuff was always available. That has come to an end, and we're just seeing the last pieces of it degrade. We have to build the new thing if we want that lifestyle and that quality of life. And so when we talk about things like the border and when we talk about the solutions that Project 2025 proposes, it proposes perverse incentives and it proposes solutions that fail to actually meet the problems in front of us. They're solving the wrong problem. They're trying to solve a race, ethnicity, and cultural problem that they see, where what I think Pierce and I both see is the most amazing economic growth opportunity ever in our history. And the population that's going to help us do that might be being kept out at a border that we never developed the policy around, making it so that someone could be vetted and qualified to work in our country for a certain number of years before they had to reapply. We just did away with anything that would make that happen in a sensible, cogent way, and have never fixed it.
Yeah.
And so now we're fighting about it in the halls of my campus.
I mean, what's crazy, so the funny thing is, I mean, it's good that two people are, I guess, civically engaged to some degree. The Republican politicians have used this as brown people as a dog whistle for a very long time. And this is just, the thing is, the Project 2025 has written policy based off of a dog whistle that Republicans have used to scare voters who actually care about the brown people. When meanwhile, they know it's not a problem. They know that, in fact, it's a problem to not have that labor in the workforce within our agricultural area. So all of what's crazy to me is when I look at the Trump presidency, him running right now, and the MAGA party, there's no policy. Like, even Project 2025, I guess, I mean, because they're not claiming it, because Trump is trying to distance himself from that, they don't have policy. It's just like border and end wokeness and jail political opponents and blah, blah, blah. Like, there's no framework for how we're going to fix the problems in our country. And that is just the craziest thing for me, that so many people in our country don't get that. They don't understand that portion of it. They see Trump and they go, that's the guy. He's fighting for me. When he says I'm going to be dictator for a day, when I'm going to do this. I really love the way you laid this out. And I know we didn't cover Project 2025 in this hour, like, directly so much, but you did a really good job of painting what the conditions are that actually led us to where we are versus what the narrative has been spun to many of our MAGA Republican brethren, as I have to begrudgingly say, the lies that they've been told for God, how many years. And I think, to put a bow on this conversation, because I see we're at the hour already and I've got to get back to work. One of the things that's, for me, that's been fascinating about this is the idea that we're going to not address these issues, where they'll just kick them down the line constantly, and while the Democrats have the issue in front of them. And then when the Republicans have it, they completely ignore the issue. Like, this is the ultimate form of gaslighting. And frankly, we've gotten to a point where we can't let this continue to happen. We have to call it out for what it is. We have to call spade a spade. We have to say, hey, look, we put together a border bill and you guys shot it down. We voted on the border bill you guys put on. And you said, well, we don't like that the Ukraine aid is tied to it. But when we had the Ukraine aid, so then we give you the Ukraine aid, and they're like, well, we're not going to pass the Ukraine aid unless you have the border tied to it. So we put the border bill on the Ukraine aid, and they go, oh, well, we don't like that border bill. And we're like, but you wrote the border bill. All of this happened this last year when it came to just the border. And I lost my train of thought, so I'm sorry.
No, well, thank you for your remarks, and I appreciate you validating what I've been saying, because I hope to communicate to our audience an understanding that a doctrine like Project 2025 is the essence of the XY problem. And I'll say it very quickly. Project 2025 attempts to solve problem X. They define problem X throughout the entire doctrine. They lay it out very clearly. This is problem X, and we're going to solve it with this doctrine. the whole time, problem Y is actually what we need to work on, and problem X undermines the success of solving problem Y. Because we never got our minds around the realities that time marches on. Boomers were once young and fresh-faced and infiltrating the workforce, and now they're home with their feet up. And this is the trap that we get in as Americans, that we're all very smart. We all have these great perspectives on the thing that we do best. And it's so easy to get us into this XY problem fight where we're distracted by problem X. It doesn't matter. And then we'd never get around to fixing problem Y. And that is the central thesis of what I wanted to talk about today. But it's nice to get the ideas about demography out there because we are in it.
Yeah. I think that's a good bow. I appreciate, I want to say thank you to all of our new listeners. I know we've acquired a lot because we've focused on the Project 2025 stuff. I do want to put a little caveat on that. We won't forever keep delving on it. And this was kind of our last episode. We really want to focus on it for now. Unless, somebody starts saying, hey, could you guys look at this chapter or something? Maybe, if enough people want us to look at a specific chapter. But I do want you guys to know we're going to continue to talk about a wide variety of topics. I think, because, and specifically ones that affect us as veterans too. It just so happens that decisions from the Supreme Court recently and Project 2025 and our presidential election, all of these things as Americans and as veterans, it affects us. So I would just want to say thank you to everybody who's been enjoying our show. And if you guys have feedback for us or anything like that, we're open to it. And just a general thanks.
Likewise, and welcome to the program.
Yeah, welcome to the program. Hopefully you guys stick around. You came for the Project 2025. You stick around for some science, engineering, a little history, and some other stuff that we like to throw into our podcast. So with that, Richard, I can't wait to have another one with you soon, and I'll talk to you very quickly.
All right, buddy. Signing off. I'll see you next time.
All right, you too.